How do you give a visual expression to a national tragedy? To a horrific happening that hits you and changes your perception of life, even when you yourself have not been hurt? And how do you rise above the disaster in a way that gives it a meaning for the future, for other generations? And how do you do it so that it may echo also in the hearts of people who were impacted tragically? No memorial can answer the personal pain that was suffered by the victims and the victims' families. A week before 9/11, my sister, on a visit to New York, went to view the city from the top of the World Trade Center. Just 1 week. It still makes me think, and quite often, about the randomness in which some of us were spared, while others were not. When the commissioners of Montgomery County announced the competition to design and build a 9/11 memorial, they stipulated that it would have to include an I-beam that was once a part of the North Tower. The I-beam provided the memorial with an immediate and direct connection to 9/11, contextually and visually. Like the tower from which it came, the I-beam is a victim and a symbol. Like the towers, it became an unwilling participant in the horrors of the day. When I first saw the I-beam, it was lying on its side on the floor at the Firefighters Academy in Norristown, next, so symbolically, to a fire engine. The exploding fire has torn and twisted it beyond any resemblance to its original shape. Rather than industrial, it looked vulnerable, human, almost fetal. So different from what we are accustomed to in city construction. It was such a special moment, almost holy, as if time had stopped, and I went down on my knees and caressed it. I lived with the I-beam for a long time, and it never became inanimate. The association to the horror made it so powerful and still so poignant that one could argue that just anchoring the I-beam could have been enough to serve as a memorial. But I wanted to expand beyond. I wanted to say something about the transformation, the embedding of the event in our memory, the way it rises into it, the way it may shape our future by becoming part of it, the solace we may arrive at some point, the strength we acquire every time we go through fire, the hope that we will always rise and rise stronger no matter what comes our way. The movement of the memorial was also born out of the shape of the I-beam. Looking at the I-beam, I realized that the gravity center fell outside its curve. This gave me a great opportunity to create a tilted memorial, a memorial that will have every component shoot into the sky in a diagonal direction, so dramatic and different from the traditional 90-degree position we are accustomed to see. When the I-beam was brought to my studio, it was too large to be moved in. I built a scaffolding system 20 feet tall, and the I-beam was attached to it with chains and raised or lowered by a pulley. The image of the I-beam that I first saw on the internet when the international competition to build a 9/11 memorial was announced was so strong that immediately I saw it raised to the sky by a huge pair of hands. The cuddling of the beam by the hands expressed poignancy. The act of raising was a movement of optimism, and the character of the hands, strong yet tender, surrounding yet barely touching, reflected the complexity of feelings we always have whenever we think about 9/11. Hands have been the subject of my work for a long time, for my early days as a painter. They are most expressive, and the forms they create when they move are more versatile than any other part of the body. More important, unlike face, we are seldom interested in the identity of whose hands we are looking at. In such, they are universal, all-encompassing, and are the emotional voice for all of us. All bronze sculptures are first created in clay. This is where the vision is. This is where the excitement and the revelation bear fruit. It is the climax of the creative process. It is sensual and tactile, and ultimately, everything that takes place in clay will be present in the finished bronze. Other than clay, everything else is just basically an industrial process in which one material is replaced by another. So you start with clay. But clay is very heavy, and it cannot hold itself without an interior support, like bones under the flesh. So all clay sculptures need first a skeleton, if you will, an interior armature. For proper support, the armature will have to be hidden in the center of each part of the clay sculpture. It must be planned ahead, and it requires that you see the sculpture in your mind's eye before you start. This is not a process that you discover as you go along. The armature needs to capture the movement of the finished piece. An armature that does not stand on its own merit, artistically, like a stick figure drawing, will not lead to a successful sculpture. Initially, I used aluminum to bend and create the core of the hands, but ultimately, due to the size, it had to be copied by a welder in heavy steel tubing. Then, to create the fingers, I cut over 100 styrofoam rings. I strung them one by one over the armature tubing and then covered them with the toothy wire. To minimize the weight of the clay even further, the armature was wrapped in chicken wire. To create the palms and the wrists, I filled the wire cavities with injected liquid foam. I planned to build the two hands separately and fit them together under the I-beam outside, stage by stage. The two armatures were pushed together repeatedly and finalized only in relationship to the beam. So were the hands, that grew heavier and heavier as they were padded with clay. At the end, each weighed close to 2,000 pounds, and it took the muscle power of 5 men to slowly push just one. You can never execute such a complicated project without the help of others. When the clay was complete, it was trusted to the hands of the mold maker. Without a mold, no casting can take place. And the first task for the mold maker, who is faced with a complicated and very large sculpture, is to partition the work into manageable sections. Only then can he start covering the clay with layers of rubber silicone, a material that is best to record every detail of the clay. Ultimately, all is encased in a thick plaster and reinforced with metal bars. The accuracy, strength, and durability are essential to the production of future castings. And you cannot pour molten bronze into a mold made of rubber without destroying it. So there's a middle stage of creating a replacement of the mold that will be able to withhold the heat. Using the mold, you replicate the clay sculpture in wax and create around it another skin that can be placed in the hot furnace. But each time you replace one material with another, you need to evaluate the transition, and I always spend days in the foundry reworking the wax in order to melt away rough edges that could be forgiven in the soft clay. When the wax is finished, it is cut even into smaller sections in order to fit into the furnace and facilitate even temperature throughout the casting. Then the pieces are gated with a piping system through which the melted wax will pour out, the molten bronze will pour in, and the gases will be allowed to escape. When completed, each section is dipped in a sand bath that will finally harden into a ceramic shell. It is quite exciting to witness the firing and the pouring of the bronze. The heat melts the wax, hence the name Lost Wax Method, and the cavity of the ceramic shell is filled with red, hot bronze. Only when the metal cools, it solidifies. Breaking the ceramic shell and discarding the gating and letting the golden sculpture appear into daylight is always connected in my mind to birth. The hands were cast in 23 pieces. Welding them together was not an easy task. Unfortunately, the heat always causes some distortion, and it takes great skills and experience to join the pieces and bring them back into their original shape. It is a technique that requires great precision, which is very difficult when the sculpture is not just large and heavy, but is also angled with delicate touching points. Eventually, each welded seam has to be chased and grinded so that no evidence is left of the constructing process. When the metalwork was completed, the two hands looked as if they were made of gold, which is the natural color of bronze created by its mixture of copper, zinc, and lead. Under torch heat, we applied layers and layers of different acids that created a dark pigmentation of rich patina that would enable the bronze to resist the corroding outside elements for years to come. The same process that was applied to the hands was repeated with the other parts of the memorial. Their hands were to rise over a tilted square column that was anchored to a huge disc. They both were welded directly from bronze sheets that were delivered from Colorado, and they needed an interior structure of web-like stainless steel grid to sustain the weight of over 10,000 pounds and the height of close to 18 feet that was compounded by the tilted angle. The part of the memorial, the steel I-beam that was protected from future rust by layers of lacquer, the bronze hand attached to the bronze square column, and the bronze disc were transported to the site separately by crane and trucks. The size inhibited us from using the highway, so for hours we drove through slow, narrow country roads. When we reached Norristown, The nearby streets were closed to local traffic, and the cranes were used to lower the parts onto the Plaza Courthouse, where it took days for the memorial to be reassembled and retouched. In reflecting on 9/11, I wanted to commemorate not just the victims, but also the so many acts of heroism and courage that were carried out by the first responders, the firefighters, the police, the medics, and the countless volunteers. In remembering, you give life. In commemorating, you lift. As sad and horrific as it was, the essence of the memorial lies in its movement. Two strong hands are lifting an icon of the tragedy. This is what I hope to end up conveying, the lifting.